The sanctioning of two oil companies was the first measure and only measure that President Trump has taken since he came back in office, and there could still be a lot to come. We still are waiting, for example, for the secondary sanctions on those who consume Russian oil, and there was always talk under the Lindsey Graham Blumenthal bill in the Senate that a tariff of 500% would be put on those who consume Russian oil should that bill go through, the sort of secondary sanctions bill. Now, by itself, it won't do that much, I don't think, but you need to look at it in conjunction with the Ukrainian deep attacks on Russian refineries. Probably 40% of their capacity has gone, and alongside, for example, in the last few days, the attacks on part of the Russian shadow fleet, those tankers which change their flag and registration very often to take Russian oil illegally. Now, there's always this notion that Russia, according to, for example, Senator McCain a few years ago, that Russia is no more than a gas station with nukes masquerading as a country. So certainly one of the options to bring Putin to the negotiating table is to make sure that there is a potential for an implosion in the economy of Russia. Now, I think that again has the potential for being a sort of fallacy from a Western viewpoint. We're not really sure where the pressure point actually lies. And there's a thing in bias terms called the fatal attribution error, when you think that you can do things because you're looking through a Western prism. So, for example, by December 23, Zaluzhny, for example, sort of said, we thought that the casualties that Russia had would have stopped anyone, but it didn't stop Russia because they look at casualties and through a different prism than the West. That might still be the same with the economic sort of side of life. It really comes back again there to what Prigozhin said a few years ago, that Russia might have to live like North Korea for 5 years. And is that something they could do? Now, if you've had sort of digital authoritarianism and hacked the minds of your people for 25 years, you really don't know if that is true or not. And that's one of the difficulties of measuring what pressure Russia really is under in economic terms. So that is why I think that why Putin would like to come to a denouement in seeking a sort of not ceasefire, but some sort of peace. But again, I would see it at the moment as sort of Yalta redux, and that the greatest success that Stalin had in 1945 was not because of winning the Battle of Stalingrad or the Battle of Kursk. It was winning the battle at the conference table, which essentially goes back to the regaining lost territory and spheres of influence, because it was that Yalta Conference which allowed the USSR to move its western borders westwards, and why Putin has often said, including at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, that the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century was the demise of the Soviet Union. And indeed, he does seek to recreate that in my mind. Well, I think you have to divide the thing really into two different things geographically, the Bucharest Nine. Now, the Bucharest Nine are those which were part of the old USSR and willingly sought to join the EU and NATO after the demise of the Soviet Union because of really the way they'd been treated by the Russians. You know, they wanted security, real security from Russia, and joining NATO and the EU being westward looking was part of that. That's not the same with Serbia, for example, but ultimately, a country serves its vital interest, and your vital interest should be, you know, how your population and economy and things like that grow for the future. So, if you think you can twist on the West rather than twist on Russia, then you're probably going to do that. Do I think that Russia would allow that? Not necessarily. Again, it would use those levers of hybrid warfare, information ops, to things like that to try and degrade that. And if not, you never know what's going to come. That's why, for example, they invaded Georgia in 2008, and why they still got peacekeeping forces in Transnistria, not allowing Moldova to have a Western posture. So there are still those levers. Russia's not going to give up those things very easily. I do think that there is a thing called the hubris nemesis complex, which he meets. The CIA first came up with this in the 1990s, looking at sort of Milosevic and those sorts of things. But, one of the problems, I think, with the current sort of negotiations, and what I think the article from the Wall Street Journal really warns us against in the last few days, is that Trump really looks at these things through a geo-economic prism. It's all to do with mercantilism and what people can get out of economic deals. The geo-economic theory of international relations was really disregarded about 25 years ago. And this is why it's not good way to look at this with Putin, in that Putin looks at things in terms of power, the accumulation of power and the accumulation of territory. That is why wars are fought. Wars are fought for political objectives, not for economic objectives. So it would be folly to look at it through that prism. And that's why, again, you come back to the sort of notion of Yalta Redux, because one of the things about that is the same way that Trump looks at Putin is the same way that Roosevelt looked at Stalin. That is, that he thought that he could use personal diplomacy. They get on in the way that Trump and Putin gets on to ameliorate the worst excesses of Putin. And I just don't think that is achievable or possible with President Putin.